Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vanessa Mantilla, and I wish to welcome you once again to the AFIN seminar series. I'm very pleased to present today's seminar as the speaker is one of the most relevant international experts on critical menstrual studies, and it's a pleasure to have here Chris Bobel with us today. And by way of summary, considering her great academic trajectory, Chris Bobel, a PhD, is a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston in USA. Recent publications include the managed body, developing girls and menstrual health in the global south, which won the 2020 award for the outstanding book in sociology of the development from the American Sociological Association, and the Palgrave Handbook of Critical Menstruation Studies, which to date has been downloaded nearly 2 million times. So at the end of the presentation, we will have about 40 minutes long, and we will have a space of question and answers, which you can ask, comment, or reflect either by using the microphone or by writing in the chat. So Chris, welcome to AFIN seminar, and you can start whenever you want.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here to listen to my remarks. I'm really gratified to have this opportunity. It's so lovely, especially to talk to audiences outside the US. Are you able to see the slides?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So I have prepared some remarks and some slides to get you thinking, and I most of all look forward to our conversation. I will try to move slowly, but please, if anything is unclear, just put it in the chat or make sure you pose a question or comment afterward, and I'm happy to clarify. So for more than 20 years, I have been studying and supporting the global menstrual activist movement and the interdisciplinary field of critical menstruation studies. And because I firmly believe we have to find the courage and the humility to critique the things we love, I have been vocal about the ways I find the movement lacking, in hopes of building a stronger, more durable, and more inclusive movement. Over time, menstrual activism, as I call it, has increasingly stood on its own, pulling away from its environmental, consumer rights, and feminist health roots, and later its anti-capitalist, punk, and anarchist connections. This is a mistake. I reject framing menstrual activism as a fight for dignity, a claim that relies on the social construction of the menstruating body as abject. Menstrual activism can draw on the broader movement for embodied autonomy by connecting to reproductive justice movements and a differently articulated bridge to the human rights movement. Menstrual activism, after all, is part of the complex and enduring project of loosening the social control of women's bodies, of working to move embodiment more generally from object to subject status. While menstrual activism is about bleeding, unapologetically so, it is also not only about bleeding. The work of reframing menstruation is foundational to taking on a host of other urgent issues, from human trafficking to eating disorders to sexual assault. This means that menstrual activism can link up to the broader feminist movement in robust and meaningful ways, particularly the radical feminist movement that seeks to look at the deeper root structures of inequalities that are based in patriarchy, racism, classism, and homophobia. When we regard the menstrual cycle as a normal biological process and a vital sign, we reject the idea that menstruation is merely a nuisance, a foil to femininity, and a business opportunity. This does not mean that period hate is necessarily replaced with period love. For some, including those who experience painful periods and those who are female-bodied but do not identify as women or girls, menstruation can be traumatic troublesome, even dangerous. A progressive and radical menstrual activism does not replace one dogma with another. Rather, it looks to the root causes of menstrual stigma in order to detach the menstrual cycle from commodification and medicalization. So in my talk today, and thank you again for indulging me and having me, a special thanks to Vanessa and to Paula and all of FN, which is an incredible organization, and I'm quite jealous. I'm drawing on an analysis I did with my colleague Brianne Foz. In it, we argue that a bloodless politics of menstruation, of today's menstrual activism, is dangerously accommodationist, as it constantly strives for social acceptability and incremental change. More specifically, we assert the movement has turned its back on its radical history to reinvent itself as a neoliberal enterprise, one that repeatedly turns to the market to solve the so-called problem of menstruation. This leads us to ask, is menstrual activism now anemic? We build our concerns on this distressing shift in core values and their attendant actions by drawing upon recent literature that sounds alarm bells about, for instance, the rise of respectability politics, particularly as it connects to the increased policing of bodies. While we recognize that respectability politics works as a so-called within-system strategy to gain political rights, we also want to reemphasize the ways that this approach neglects a more radical reading and interpretation of the root causes of stigma and oppression, often using a Band-Aid approach to solving menstrual stigma. So I will outline the ways that hypervisibility of menstrual products has ultimately and ironically moved menstruation back into hiding, and more importantly, largely failed to examine the origins of menstrual stigma. We want to instead consider the value of menstruating in public, figuratively or literally, but also shine a bright light on this widely shared but rarely discussed experience by bringing forward a bloody, messy, embodied version of menstruation so that the roots of menstrual stigma can be visible. Ultimately, we argue for a new vision of menstrual activism that prioritizes what we term radical menstrual embodiment. Because the language of menstruation is bounded by the vocabulary of sexism and the grammar of capitalism, people are socialized to think about menstruation through products. Tampons, pads, cups, underwear, and even birth control, as Liz Kissling argues. This is a view that distracts from a more robustly complex analysis of the sociocultural and political realities that shape menstrual subjectivities. We assert instead a radical critique of this framing of menstruation as a product-focused one that strips menstrual activism of its more profound critical capacity and sands down the rough edges of the movement and produces a solution that hides menstruation from public view. Imagine the outcomes if other movements adopted this kind of accommodationist stance. For instance, the health at every size or anti-fat phobia movement might begin promoting Weight Watchers or other diets. The Black Lives Matter movement, which began, of course, in the US, but has spread globally, might hold workshops to train people of color to politely interact with the police. These are just two examples. The blunting of the radical edge has a long history in social movements and feminist projects. Barbara Ehrenreich and Gail Sulik both have aptly critiqued the breast cancer industry as routinely pinkwashing women's experiences. This is another example of accommodationist. They fetishize, this movement fetishizes survivor status and minimizes that women do indeed die from breast cancer. It uses breast cancer to sell products and engage in corporate partnerships. And so we join Nancy Fraser, a feminist philosopher, who calls for a redirection of social movements toward larger scale, radical thinking that reckons again with transformation as alternative to what she calls the fortunes of feminism, that reveal a tamer form of feminism in the post-capitalist era. In summary, an interest in respectability leads to a shift in values towards safety and institutionalization, which then facilitates co-optation's exponential increase. With this turn, the movement becomes vulnerable to capitalist exploitation. The new priorities of the menstrual activism movement, such as organizing product drives, setting up social businesses and NGOs to provide products to girls and women in the global South, and developing policy and other legal interventions to mandate governments provide products in schools, prisons, and public spaces, all reduce menstrual activism to a movement to what historian Shara Vostral terms technologies of passing, the methods, commercial or homemade, that enable menstruators to pass as non-menstruators, to conceal the stigmatized biological process that marks them as female-bodied. So, given this history of menstrual activism and its changing priorities, this next part of the talk will examine three key frames that conceptualize the current movement's issues and priorities: public health, human rights in the context of global development, and gender equity. Our aim is to expose the problematic conceptualizations that are set in motion by these tamer forms of menstrual activism, and they reign supreme today. The vision guiding these three frames, we assert, remains mired in the menstrual mandate of shame, silence, and secrecy, because it does not fundamentally question the norms of embodiment rooted in the denial of the female body. So the first, public health. As a field is invested in promoting healthy behaviors that prevent illness and disease. Thus, this particular framework rationalizes certain foci, such as improving access to products for the poor who, it is feared, will develop illness if they do not use so-called hygienic means to manage their menstrual flow. Of course, poor and homeless menstruators should be afforded unrestricted access to the materials they need to care for their periods. That is not in dispute. But the public health frame must also engage why agencies, until recently, did not typically provide menstrual materials to the people they serve. Furthermore, the menstrual cycle as a meaningful marker of health and well-being, indeed the fifth vital sign, receives scant attention in this frame. Most menstrual discourse, and thus action, decontextualizes menstruation, excising it from the continuous menstrual cycle that impacts multiple body systems. Such a limited view is a missed opportunity. There are some members of the medical community, however, who have registered the importance of the menstrual cycle. Here is an example from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Here, the frame is widened to take stock of more than the monthly shedding of the uterine lining. Still, like all moves to make menstruation more public, more accessible, more meaningful, there are hazards to this too. For example, Lahiri Dutt, in her examination of campaigns targeting menstruators in South Asia, finds fault with menstrual health campaigns rendering menstruation as a medical problem or a medicalized problem that, in her words, reduce menstruation to a universal feminine experience and as a strictly biological condition. Such medicalized renderings pose two threats. One, they can pathologize the menstrual cycle, rendering a natural bodily process into a medical condition that requires intervention, such as the indiscriminate prescribing of birth control without exploring underlying conditions. And two, delinking menstruation from sexuality in spite of the common association between menstruation and fertility, one that often positions the menstruating girl as sexually available and or marriageable. And yet, contemporary menstrual activist discourse severs this cultural connection, thrusting girls into an ambivalent state, marked but muted as potentially sexual. In short, current conceptualizations of menstrual activism as a public health concern are too narrow. They tend to reduce menstruation to a matter of hygiene to prevent infection, despite a dearth of evidence to establish a link between menstrual product materials and illness, and privilege the improvement of access to menstrual products over more substantive concerns. The public health frame also narrowly constructs menstruation as a medical condition that detaches the biological process from the social and emotional meanings that profoundly shape the menstrual experience, including a fuller reckoning with the entire menstrual cycle as much more than a signal of fertility, but also a robust health marker. The second menstrual activist framework, human rights, that I offer for consideration, mobilizes to improve access to menstrual care materials, infrastructure such as toilets, water, and disposal, and to a lesser degree, menstrual and puberty health education. This frame is especially prominent in what's called the menstrual hygiene management, or MHM, movement flourishing in low and middle income countries, where advocates explain how MHM is key to the achievement of several rights, including the rights to good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, decent work, and economic growth. Tying MHM to human rights, often through the Sustainable Development Goals, has been a productive move. It has pried open a dialogue around a deeply tabooed topic, but simultaneously framing menstruation as a human rights issue, specifically through discourses of dignity, enables activists to talk about menstruation without talking about blood. Using the language of dignity to discuss menstrual health is at once clever and deeply problematic. After all, who can argue with the human right to dignity? But the uses of dignity in menstrual activist discourse presents a curious paradox. While MHM advocates persistently challenge the stigma of menstruation through sloganeering such as break the silence and smash the shame, they advance concrete interventions focused on keeping menstruation hidden through so-called upgraded menstrual care materials, such as replacing cloth, which is accessible, sustainable, and affordable, with Western-style single-use pads, cups, or cloth pads designed expressly for menstruation. Our complaint is not with the general deployment of the human rights frame per se. Rather, we grow uneasy with how MHM discourses uses a particularly potent human rights principle to inadvertently accommodate stigma. MHM's focus on managing the menstrual body so that no evidence of menstruation is detected, thereby preserving dignity, reifies the menstrual mandate of shame, silence, and secrecy. In summary, the deployment of human rights discourse in the emerging menstrual activist movement, which is not limited to the global south, of course, produces a complicated picture. It effectively arrests attention and situates itself as a legitimate issue of development, but it simultaneously constructs the brown and Black body as a problem in need of solution. When the trope of dignity is leveraged to argue for menstrual product access, the underlying assumption is that the body that discloses its menstrual status is necessarily undignified. Thus, the discourse fails to trouble the pervasively negative view of menstruation, especially for racialized bodies. Rather, it quietly accommodates it. In this way, the public discourse of menstruation works to reinforce stigma rather than resist it. Now, the third and final frame, This is an outgrowth of liberal feminism. It's often called the gender equity frame, also menstrual equity or period poverty. And it takes a liberal feminist assessment of the gendered inequitable distribution of resources. The value of this approach lies in contesting men's body as standard. A key fixation in the frame is the eradication of the so-called tampon tax, an agenda that places central emphasis on menstrual products at the expense of more substantive social critiques of social class, menstrual visibility, and intersections with gender and sexuality, even while the theoretical underpinning of the menstrual equity frame explicitly acknowledges sexism. The obsession with the tampon tax and increasing campaigns at national levels to make products free targets an achievable goal that makes a negligible, although arguably symbolic, difference in women's financial lives as a stand-in for the far more complicated and multifaceted goals of radical menstrual activism, such as critiquing systems in which women's health and women's bodies, as well as trans and non-binary bodies, are ignored. As scholar and artist Zoyander Street asserted, quote, even if sales taxes on sanitary products were lifted, it would only make a small dent in the impact that menstruation has on the lives of people in severe poverty, end quote. As we note, the myriad campaigns against the tax rely on and even perpetuate a stigmatized assumption of menstruation as nuisance. Here's some examples of Instagram posts from various NGOs working on eliminating the tampon tax. In addition to fighting for menstrual product access, a related set of efforts that fall under this frame are focused on the design of better and more user-friendly menstrual products. And what's more, the campaigns rely on a social construction of menstruation as nuisance, hardly a body positive or body neutral way of conceptualizing the very thing one seemingly aims to destigmatize. For example, innovations in femtech have emerged as solutions to the socially constructed problem of menstruation. Using this frame, the need for better, more sophisticated, more cutting edge, more convenient, and more so-called lifestyle-friendly menstrual care products is socially constructed. Yet again, the menstruating body is situated as a problem that is best solved through consumption. Or borrowing from political philosopher Michael Sandel's words, menstrual activism is another case of the marketization of everything. We argue that the problem with this approach, embodied most clearly in the relentless emphasis on products as the solution, is that it cedes the menstrual activist movement to the product makers by advancing, again, Shara Vostral's notion of technologies of passing, while failing to advance a truly liberatory body politics. That is, menstruation becomes merely material, whereby the solution to gender inequity is to supply more material to more women and others who menstruate, and to make those products more fun, less expensive, and more user-friendly. We dispute this approach because it relies too heavily on consumer culture, and it uses government to authorize capitalism to swallow menstrual activism whole. Of course, the products themselves designed to mask and hide menstruation become the thing, the silver bullet, if you will, to champion and celebrate. While the menstrual equity frame is ostensibly intersectional through its emphasis on poor and otherwise marginalized menstruators, it is an impoverished reckoning with the complexity of menstruators' lives, one that is too tightly cleaved to menstruators as consumers, a monodimensional and indeed commodified rendering of the embodied experience. We also see this kind of product-focused neoliberal framing as dangerous because it situates menstrual activism as very, very small in focus, a move that makes it more difficult to link menstrual activism to other social movements. The lack of broader critique represented through product-based activism, let's say of the prison industrial complex, of class warfare, of police brutality, and institutionalized racism, of fat phobia, of transphobia, and body shaming and policing trivializes menstrual activism and lessens its potential political impact. As alternative, the realization of what we call radical menstrual embodiment insists on taking seriously what it means to be radical. So we push beyond the colloquial meaning of radical as extreme to reclaim radical as relating to the root. Thus, a politics of radical embodiment is one that aims to remove the source of body negativity that grows in the soil of white supremacist heteronormative misogyny. To wit, menstrual activism must necessarily remain focused on shame-based perceptions of menstruation that shape the menstrual experience, that run contrary to seeing the body as a site of power and pleasure. This attention must be focused not only on the shedding of the uterine lining, but more broadly, the entire menstrual cycle across the lifespan, from menarche through menopause for diverse bodies. This expanded view makes room for a broader range of experiences relative to the many phases of the menstrual cycle, including those of marginalized menstruators, as well as associated disorders and diseases such as endometriosis, which I know Vanessa is working on, and polycystic ovary syndrome, and more. Resistance then requires challenging assumptions about the body. It demands that we rip out the diseased root of menstrual stigma. Menstrual activists must re-examine their strategic priorities to fundamentally challenge rather than reify stigma. With encouragement, there are some great initiatives underway. For instance, the Kenya-based social business and foundation hybrid Zana Africa is publishing a feminist reproductive health magazine with content geared toward girls and featuring body-positive boys. But such approaches remain exceptions that prove the rule. So what will it take to capture more attention and drive more resources toward a more radical politics of embodiment? First, we refer activists to the origins of menstrual activism, a movement inspired by feminist critiques of medicalization and commodification of the body. Remembering this history and the alternative views that animated it, we can redirect today's menstrual activism, returning it to its agenda of challenging stigma. Activists must turn to the available research to ground their efforts, of course, and that's why your work in this community is so important. Despite an immature evidentiary basis that links product access to outcomes like improved school attendance and the avoidance of infection, you've probably heard it stated over and over, girls are dropping out of school because they don't have access to pads, for instance, or women are getting sick and dying because they don't have access to clean menstrual care materials. There really isn't good data to support those claims. And yet, most initiatives targeting menstruators in the global South in particular include product provision. It is troubling that activists assert the power of products to impact lives when the research base for these interventions thus far is thin. And I am wrapping up. Thank you for your patience. Menstrual negativity ignites a vicious cycle. Poverty of knowledge fuels stigma, and stigma prevents the acquisition of knowledge. As I often say, stigma grows in the dark. Stigma, as it relates to the public deployment of menstrual knowledge, is especially dangerous in these ways. So why not challenge resources toward menstrual health education that challenges the narrative of stigma? Promoting menstrual literacy, as I call it, is protective across the life course. In particular, early puberty education that includes important information about the body, research shows impacts children's health outcomes throughout their lives. Menstrual activists need analyses of body positive and menstrual health messaging that could guide efforts to develop, for instance, non-branded, that means not corporately sponsored, menstrual education in schools, which is the norm in the US. But if the focus is narrowly trained on product access, the root issue of menstrual stigma remains obscured. So what to do? The recommendations are clear that anything we do is meaningless if we don't make a commitment to link arms with neighboring movements, such as reproductive justice and labor and environmental justice and Me Too or Quintello or Yo También and Black Lives Matter and its related movements all over the globe that pay attention to the injustices brought upon Black and brown bodies using state violence. If menstrual activism hopes to grow into a durable, polyvocal, and resonant movement for social change, it must join other movements that rewrite the rules of embodiment through an intersectional feminist lens. No quest to sanitize or make respectable menstruation will ever meet the fundamental needs of menstruators. Instead, we must reimagine menstruation as fiercely and defiantly in public, with menstrual product access as only one of many different facets of a bold new movement. Done right, menstrual activism is public feminism par excellence, moving embodiment, especially reproductive embodiment, out of the shadows. Radical menstruation embodiment can model a grassroots, transnational, anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal, anti-racist, and anti-classist politics of thought into action. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Such a great work. That was very interesting presentation. And this conversation is very important nowadays due to some legislation, such as here in Catalonia. I don't know if you heard about the free distribution of reusable menstrual products that was approved not long ago.
Oh, I did not hear that. So so that is at the state level? What's the actual?
No, it's the community. It's in just in Catalonia.
Okay, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And that will be free products in schools, or what exactly does it provide?
No, in the pharmacy. You can get it in the pharmacy with your sanitary card.
Okay. Oh, you have.
And you can get them, but you have just one product to get.
Okay, I see.
So it's
okay.
one product per person.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, but if you don't have the legal status to be here as immigrant, for example, you cannot get them.
I see. Interesting. So it doesn't really touch the most marginalized members of your community. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And yeah, it's related with what you talk about intersectionality and other movements.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now we will open the question and answers space, giving the word to the attendees. Please raise your hand and I will take turns in chronological order. Okay, Lynn.
Can you hear me? It's a little hard to hear. Oh.
We cannot hear you, Lynn.
How about now?
Oh, perfect.
Yes. Okay. You can hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Sorry about that. And I think I was transitioning from the car. I apologize, but Vane, did you ask about the new leave for the regla?
No, we haven't talked yet.
Okay. I can't hear very well. Okay, so I have thank you so much. The presentation was fascinating. I loved it. And I would also just like to say, Dr. Bobel, that your slides are amazing. Like they really keep me engaged.
Oh, that makes me happy because
so-
I feel so frustrated when I'm at talks and the slides are so ugly and and just words and words and words. So I tried to break out of that mold a little bit. So thank you.
Exactly. That's what I felt, and I really, really enjoy it. So I have a comment that I would love for you to comment on, and then a question. So just yesterday, my 17-year-old son called me. I wasn't at home. He was at home. I'm 54. And he said, "Mom, Roxanne's on her way over and she needs to know if you have tampons or pads because she just got her period." Roxanne is a friend, not a girlfriend, but a close friend. And he was contacting me in part because he knows that I'm well into menopause. And so wasn't sure if I would have anything like that in the house anymore. And I've really noticed, that's just like an illustrative example of this relationship that my two cis male children seem to have with their female friends. And I just thought it was kind of amazing.
It is amazing. It's
and I guess
amazing
maybe,
in the way, it's
there's
amazing.
a question there, which is like, is that normal, or is that because because we're an urban progressive family? And then the other quick question for you was about, there's a new policy in Spain of sick leave for period. I apologize if it came up already because the call went in and out a little bit for me, but just how does that idea fit in with what you're talking about, and especially with the radical approach? Is that a good thing or not a good thing?
Thank you so much, Lynn. Your comment and your question are so apt. So first of all, I think your son's relationship to menstruation, his comfort and ease and seeing himself as an ally is emerging in more spaces, but I would say it's still unusual. I think it's true in certain communities, maybe with certain kinds of access to education, but overall, I would say it's still taboo to say menstruation's name and to actually to show, products in public. So it's encouraging. And I think it's exactly what we need more of. But I would not say that we're at the point yet where that's common. So I think the reason why the story stood out to you is because it's unusual, right? So I think it's perhaps pretends a brighter future for us, but we have so much work to get there. So in terms of leave, it is such a complicated question. Feminists are arguing about this. And really, there's really two very good arguments. One, of course, is to provide this leave is progressive because it recognizes diverse embodied experiences and says, I see that your body has unique needs, for breaks or rest or space or a fan, right? And that's important. If we contextualize that is any kind of measure to make workplaces more body friendly, right? So bodies with illness, disease, disability, more ergonomic workstations, more work-family balance incentives, so any space where we make bodies friendly in the workplace and sort of challenge the notion that we're just there as, robots to do the job, I think is progress. But because of persistent sexism, there is the risk that the leave will be used against female-bodied workers as evidence of their vulnerability or their unreliability or their special needs, right? So it has to be articulated in a very careful way and executed in a context that is already thinking equitably, that is already taking seriously gender inequality. Because I think if it's used in spaces where there's a culture of devaluation of women workers, it'll just fortify the view, right, of women as substandard, because we're still tied to the standard of the male body, right? And so any deviance or difference from that standard of male body is, of course, used against women in patriarchy. So in some ways, I feel like menstrual leave is ahead of its time, because we have so much more work to do to really challenge sexism in the workplace. Does that help at all, Lynn?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you really articulated beautifully some of what's been like banging around in my head about it. And yeah, and I guess it's so very new here that we'll see how it plays out, right? What women start reporting back from the field.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that PhD students are going to be writing their dissertations on this, because so we really need the good data to see, is it being used? How is it being used? What kind of context is necessary for it to be used in a positive way? And, so I feel like it's TBD, to be determined. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Chris. Is someone else, does someone else want to ask?
And just comments are
if there is anyone, I have few questions to make. One question was made by a colleague of a Fin colleague, and I will read it. Our research group has been doing research in primary school on the topic of sexuality. And as it was expected, the menstruation is a recurrent topic in our workshops. In this context, various times male teachers have told us that they intend to normalize menstruant bodies and the usage of sanitary products, but they have difficulties since they don't have menstruant bodies. How do you think they could approach this situation?
That's a really good question. So what we call menstrual subjectivity, your own experience of menstrual health across the life course, is really an important starting place. But I want to be clear that you don't have to have a menstruating body to become menstrually literate. And in fact, if that were a precondition of providing menstrual health education or support, we would really be in a fix, right? So we need to promote menstrual literacy for everybody, because it is part of body literacy, and everybody has a body, and everybody has a right and a thirst to know their bodies, right? And so I think if we step back and sort of demystify menstrual literacy and say, actually, let's think about body literacy. Let's think about how your body works, the choices you make about your body, your relationship to your body. And that sort of makes it possible for us all to engage in the conversation. So I think one of the ways menstrual stigma works is to suggest that this is something only some people should talk about, right? That it's sort of proprietary knowledge. And that's menstrual stigma at work. Because in fact, what that does is it says only those that need to know should know, because it's such kind of messy, yucky stuff, right? We want to contain the dissemination. We want to contain the discourse. So I think the first thing is to challenge the assumption that you must be a menstruator in order to be invested in and a resource for menstrual literacy, that anyone can build menstrual literacy. Anybody can learn about the body. And I think, in fact, having people that don't menstruate as educators can send a really powerful lesson. So, like I teach gender studies at a university. And in some ways, the most powerful students in my classroom are the men. And not because they're men, but because they're not women. And so when they're there, they're showing this issue of gender equality matters for everyone. You don't just have to be oppressed by the system to care about the system. In fact, those that benefit from the system have the most power to change the system, right? They have to let go of some power to make space for others. So I feel that way about who should do menstrual health education? Everybody, and maybe even especially those that don't have the embodied experience, because it signals that this matters. It matters for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer
Thank
the
you for the
question?
answer.
It's a really good question. What do you think, Vanessa?
About this question particularly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, based on my short research, uh, one of the things I saw is what I think is that male young men and adult men have to be more involved in these
Yeah,
issues, because when this issue, especially about menstruation, no, in this case, is related just to women, looks
yeah,
like it has to be private, and
yes,
at the
yes,
end, we how we say, we feed the idea of
yeah,
privacy,
yeah, yes,
stigmatization. Is
yes,
that correct?
yes, yes. Right. Yeah. And
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
something I've been writing about, is that framing menstruation as a private issue is actually counterproductive, because it's exactly it's, as I say, stigma grows in the dark. So if we say only certain people should talk about this in only certain places, then what we're just doing is we're accommodating menstrual stigma. So we have to normalize it. And so I say, like, it's important that in primary schools and in secondary schools that we talk about menstrual health, not just in health class, but in history class, in literature class, in math class. There's ways you can work this body process, which is, experienced by half the world's population for, can be 50 years of the lifespan, and continues beyond menstruation, right? Lynn and I, menopausal, right? We're still experiencing a relationship with our bodies, and we still need support and resources. So we really need to talk about this in all kinds of places and all kinds of relationships, men and men and women and trans folks and cis folks. So I think the idea of normalization is so super important, but we have to take that seriously. And normalization does mean everywhere, anywhere, right? Without limits.
Yeah, and especially, for example, in my topic, the research I'm doing, about menstrual discomfort,
Yep.
with endometriosis, when the endometriosis produces pain.
Yeah.
For example, most of the partners of the women have to be involved, because they are living the situation
Yes.
with the women. So at
Yes.
the end, they have to be involved. It's kind of,
Yes.
they feel pressed, but
Yeah.
it's a good thing. It's a good
It's
thing that
yes.
the most of the men that live endometriosis very close are
Yeah.
more aware of
Yeah.
menstrual issues in
Yeah.
general. Is what I've
Yeah.
seen in my thesis, in
Yeah,
my
and
PhD.
that's interesting, Vanessa, and tracks with what I've heard too. But what happens is that it's crisis that instigates education, right? So my partner is in pain, my partner is sick, and so now I'm going to learn. If we could set in motion, body literacy much sooner, I think we would also, I mean, I think it's key to, for instance, shortening the diagnosis, shorten the diagnosis window, which is so huge, right? Takes so long, as you know, Vanessa, for people to get diagnosed with endometriosis, and the quality of care is so poor. And I think that's linked to body illiteracy, that we normalize, right, pain, and we say, oh, that's just Eve's curse, buck up, right? Because we don't actually understand what is a normal amount of pain and what is a normal menstrual experience, or normal menstrual cycle. And so people are operating in the dark and internalizing, oh, I'm just weak, or I'm just a whiner, or I'm just a difficult person, right? So I think if we could teach body literacy sooner, people would be more comfortable saying, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. This isn't what I learned as sort of a typical menstrual cycle. And I think we could really speed up diagnosis and treatment.
I have another question, also related with endometriosis. Yeah, as we comment before, I'm doing a PhD about endometriosis, with this idea that is a social-cultural construction, and it's related, as some academics suggest, to the stigma of menstruation.
Yeah.
So, from your research, do you think that menstrual activism has had an impact on the social visibility of conditions that produce discomfort related to menstruation?
Yes, but I think it's been really minor because, again, there's so much attention placed on products. So that's what I'm pushing back against, is this very narrow conceptualization of menstrual activism, which is get pads and tampons to every menstruator, right? And so that sort of eclipses other things like pain, discomfort, right? Irregular menstrual cycles, heavy menstrual bleeding, and all the kinds of diseases and disorders related to the menstrual cycle. So they become lower priorities. So I think there's potential there, right? Again, by promoting body literacy and challenging stigma so that we're comfortable talking about this with our partners, with our providers, right? With our employers as necessary, back to the menstrual leave, question. So I think there's potential, but I think it's been really limited because there's so much emphasis on products. I mean, when I get contacted by journalists or students, it's almost always about product-based activism. It's rarely about these other dimensions like the stuff you're working on. So I think there's potential, but we have to do better, because right now it's just like, what can I find to bleed on, right?
If there is, look, Carolina.
Everyone. Well, thank you, Chris, for your wonderful presentation. I agree with Aline that the slides were wonderful. Just a brief comment and a question, because I wonder how big is the cultural change we need to start to see menstrual cycle and all the things related with women's health in a different way. Because I'm 47 and I was a teenager. It was unimaginable to talk about this with your father, with your boyfriend, with your friends. And I remember I first menstruated when I was 11, and it was the 1st of January. So the whole family was meet in the celebration of the first day of the year. And my mother has the idea to talk about, well, she is new, in Spanish we say, se hizo señorita. It became, and I felt so embarrassing in that situation. Because the idea is that, well, it is a public state, but at the same time, you cannot speak with anyone about that. You have to put everything in secret or out of the look of the men, especially the men in the family or your relatives, etc. And when I started to work in my ethnographic research with people who have indigenous background, it made a lot of sense, because in the Guarani communities, the girls who start to menstruate, they are painting in their face to announce publicly they are now in good conditions for reproduction and for be mothers and etc. I felt so identified with these young women, but at the same time, different from my family, these women are isolated from the rest of the people in the community. They have to be, because they still have, and we still have, this idea of blood, menstruational blood as pollution, as dangerous, etc. And I think in diverse forms, sometimes very subtle forms, we still think that there is something dangerous and there is something no.
Yes.
And I mean that maybe this is the question in the basis on the debate about the leaves or not leaves for menstrual troubles, because it puts again in the area of sickness or the disability.
Right.
And I'm not sure about that, because it's the same one that these people said to me, well, I got sick when they menstruate and when they deliver a child. The expression is me enfermé, is I got sick, no? And I think this is a remain of a very traditional way of thinking about menstruational blood. So you made me think in all of this. Thank you.
I'm so glad. And your comments are so smart. I mean, you bring up so many interesting ideas, right? One is the awkwardness of menstrual visibility for youth, because it's the first time we ever say it out loud. So we have to say it out loud sooner so that when they become menstrual, right, that moment of menarche, it's not such a rupture. And that's why we have to normalize menstrual talk with toddlers. You know, like I was changing my tampon in front of my children, just like I was using the toilet or brushing my hair or brushing my teeth, right? I mean, you can't be like, oh, don't, closing the door and don't let, don't see what mommy's doing. What mommy's doing is private. Of course, then when that kid becomes menstrual, right, they're going to be uncomfortable because this is the first time, they're sort of connected to this issue, which is deeply stigmatized. I really appreciate the point about like fertility rituals or menarchal rituals, because people often bring that up as an example of menstrual visibility. And while it is, remember, as you said, Carolina, as you said, it's actually a fertility marking. It's saying she's fertile, she's reproductive, she's potentially marriageable. That's not challenging menstrual stigma. That's promoting the instrumental female body, right, in service of patriarchy. So while there is visibility, it's really not the right kind of visibility, right? And thirdly, your point about framing menstruation as disability exactly goes to the heart of this debate about menstrual leave, because if we're going to normalize something, then we have to be careful how we talk about it, because if we talk about it as a disability, right, or that period of time where she's out of control, right, then we're not making progress. It's regress. I mean, I'm fascinated. I frankly, friends, I started this work 20 years ago. I thought I'd write one book or one article and then I'd move on to something else. But I felt like there were so many layers. It got more and more interesting. And as a feminist ethnographer, I felt like the questions were just endless. They were like tumbling out faster than I could engage them. So I think that it's fascinating that we construct the menstruating body as abject and as the blood as pollution. I mean, think about the specter of the menstruator. A woman bleeds, but she does not die. Right? So it's this sort of curious, strange thing that sort of falls out of the natural order of things, while indeed it's incredibly natural. But we don't know how to make sense of this material, right? This material expression of the reproductive body, because we don't value women, right? So we value their fertility, but we don't value them, right? Women are wombs, women are vessels. And so any evidence of the actual material reality, right, of the female, the reproductive body is, we like women in the abstract, right? But not in reality. So I think understanding why blood is considered pollution, why the menstruating woman is fearsome, is mysterious, is unreliable, I think digging into that is really important feminist work.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Caro, for your question, and Chris for the answer. If it's that okay for you, we can finish the seminar. It's 3 p.m. already here in Spain. Thank you, Chris, once again for this great presentation. We are very happy to have had you here. Once we have the video edited, we will let you know.
Great. And I just put my
For
email in the chat if anyone would like to follow up, one-on-one. I'm happy to engage in conversation. I'm sure I could learn a lot from you all. So please reach out if it's helpful.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the attendees, and see you in the next seminar next week.
Thank you, everyone. Be well. Take care. Do good work. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.